We live in a time of kind of temporal claustrophobia, as you mentioned, which is the phrase I take from historian Chris Clark. And I think this is something that, on the one hand, too many parties of the centre and on the left are sort of too quick to adapt to and become very kind of reactive and emergency focused in their politics. Things become an emergency when you feel powerless to address them. If you feel you've got plenty of control over a situation, or you feel you've got time on your side, even if maybe you haven't got immediate control, at least you think, well, I can play the long game here, and that maybe if I defer, then there will be a time when I can pursue the ends that I wish to. If you have this sense of either immediate or deferred control, then at least there is the capacity to kind of set out your agenda to see the world as you'd like to remake it in some fashion. And I think conversely, things become this kind of reactive logic of emergency when you're sort of just dealing with problems as they arise, precisely when you doubt your capacity to really control them. And the best you feel you can do can't really change the origins of these problems, whether it's economic equality, whether coming back to climate change. The best thing that you feel you can do is sort of respond to them in real time and cope in some fashion.
Jonathan, you're the professor of politics at LSE, and I was really keen to speak to you about your book In the Long Run, because kind of for two reasons. One was that your argument that it feels like in politics the future is being foreclosed has really structured the way I think about a lot of issues, including climate breakdown, AI, and lots of other issues. But also, secondly, on a kind of emotional level, I feel this kind of like temporal claustrophobia that you talk about kind of in my own personal life. So I'm really like excited to be able to speak to you today. So welcome to the Tech Futures Project.
Thanks very much for having me, Phil, and glad you found something interesting in the book.
Yeah, firstly, could you just summarize the argument in the long run, and maybe also say a little bit about whether you've updated any of the kind of ideas in it since you wrote the book a year ago?
Sure, yeah. I mean, the book came out of a course that I was teaching at LSE for a few years on the same theme of how how the future is used and abused in politics. So the ways in which different outlooks on the future get promoted by different types of ideologies, interest groups, and so on, and the kind of political implications that come with these. And it's a book with a tortoise on the cover, and I guess that already indicates something to do with an interest in questions of how much time one has, whether, kind of hare and the tortoise, these kind of Aesop's fable type ideas of how does one best utilize time that is somehow felt to be under pressure, and whether there are kind of certain virtues of perseverance, deliberation, and so on that maybe presuppose a certain type of way of approaching political time and that get extinguished when one approaches it in the register of high-speed emergency and so on. As you said in your intro, I guess a kind of running theme of the book is how this kind of question of how much future is felt to be available, whether it's sort of open and abundant or whether it's felt to be closing in on the present, is something which, I think it's interesting today, partly because historically, and the book is partly historical, one sees variations on this aspect. So the book starts with, I guess, an earlier phase of modernity 200 years ago, when I think a lot of revolutionary politics was very much focused on immediate transformation and the idea of the revolution that was potentially either undergoing or around the corner. And that then over the course of the 19th into the early 20th century, you get conversely a lot of politics has this sort of sense of abundant time. The slow timescales of evolution somehow seem to make their way into political thinking as well. Incrementalism, coming back to tortoises, the Fabians in this country, for whom this was their emblem and basically a kind of an image of gradualism. So there you have a kind of quite different model of politics based on, again, I think a quite different take on the future. And then all of this quite in contrast, I guess, to the present moment, where in a range of contexts, you mentioned climate change, ideas of kind of climate deadlines, I guess, 5 years, 10 years, 12 years, whatever, in which to make certain key political decisions. This is clearly how we've thought about climate change, I think, for some years now. But it's not just in that particular dimension. I think also in other dimensions of how we think about economy and economic inequality, and sort of the sense in which we have a kind of critical moment to arrest runaway concentrations of economic power, or somehow it'll be too late that the Elon Musks of this world will be sort of in an unassailable position of economic strength. So again, that sense of sort of living in a critical window where what can't be done now risks going permanently undone. You ask how my thoughts have kind of changed, I guess, since I wrote the book. I mean, clearly one thing that's happened in that period is Trump coming to power in the US, and I guess I've become perhaps more aware, something that I touch on in the book, but perhaps more aware now of the ways in which certain kinds of far-right, potentially fascist forms of politics prosper under these conditions of kind of a mixture of temporal constraint, but also the sense of the closed future, the sense that things can't be otherwise, that we are sort of living with uh, a limited array of possibilities that so many mainstream political parties seem willing to push, including Labour in this country at the moment. I think really creates an opening, something that Trump made use of in the US, and potentially that Farage and Reform will make use of in this country, create a kind of opening for that type of desire to sort of occupy the territory of the future from a far-right perspective, with ideas of disruption, of breakdown, of imminent sort of civil war is another theme that comes through, of course, in a lot of North American discourse. And I think maybe one thing, looking back on the last year, you see is there's potentially quite a lot of political appeal for people in this type of discourse of kind of breakdown, of at least something that promises change, something that promises kind of alternative to an unbearable present, as many people might experience it. So we live in a time of kind of temporal claustrophobia, as you mentioned, which is the phrase I take from historian Chris Clark. And I think this is something that, on the one hand, too many parties of the centre and the left are sort of too quick to adapt to and become very kind of reactive and emergency focused in their politics. And that this then, I think, is part of what the appeal is of those types of far-right politics, which are all about saying, no, that the future is going to be different. It may be bad. It may be a kind of a breakdown of some sort, but you don't have to simply reckon with the stasis of the present. Change is coming. Perhaps we're going to be the agents of change as well.
That's really interesting. The word abundance, it was interesting you use the word abundant, because I know that that's kind of like a commonly, or there's a kind of a whole abundance movement now. And I guess it's an interesting thing to consider whether we could have kind of like an abundant concept of time as well. But I mean, I guess one question that I was thinking about is what are the conditions that create the sense of emergency that politicians are like operating within? Is there anything, do you think it's partly to do with like our information environment, and do you think that's like additionally adding to this sense of emergency, the kind of like short-term social media dopamine filled kind of news cycle that we're in? Or what are the things that really cause this like sense of emergency?
I mean, I think it's certainly partly that, the sort of the sense that well, everything is in such permanent flux, including the news cycle, the attention cycle, that really the only way to get heard, or the only way to try and politicize anything, is to turn it into some kind of emergency that cannot wait, because anything that can be postponed is going to fall out of reckoning with this type of media environment. So I think that's certainly part of it. I think maybe what that touches on, which is perhaps slightly deeper, is a kind of a sense of absent control, of weak power. So I think something I say in the book is that things become an emergency when you feel powerless to address them. If you feel you've got plenty of control over a situation, or you feel you've got time on your side, even if maybe you haven't got immediate control. At least you think, well, I can play the long game here, and that maybe if I defer, then there will be a time when I can uh, pursue the ends as I wish to. If you have this sense of either immediate or deferred control, then at least there is the capacity to kind of set out your agenda to see the world as you'd like to remake it in some fashion. And I think conversely, things become this kind of reactive logic of emergency when you're sort of just dealing with problems as they arise, precisely when you doubt your capacity to really control them. And the best you feel you can do can't really change the origins of these problems, whether it's economic equality, whether coming back to climate change. The best thing that you feel you can do is sort of respond to them in real time and cope in some fashion. And I think this, this applies to kind of different fields of politics. So I think it applies to politicians who um, they're working in that media environment you mentioned, but they're also obviously often working with institutions that have been ravaged by austerity, that they lack kind of strong state institutions on which to rely. They may also doubt the capacity to command the allegiance of people that maybe in another age would have been long-term supporters. I think of party leaders that realize that electoral volatility is very pronounced and you can't really rely on people sticking around with you and sticking to um, uh, supporting you at the next election. So again, there's sort of the sense that you really have to accelerate your actions because you can't um, depend on long term support. And then I think also just in the wider society, it's not just a kind of question of how politicians see this world, but likewise in the wider society. If you think of the kind of emergency discourse that comes from below, from social movements, something like Extinction Rebellion, for example, where clearly this was pretty central to the framing of the climate change predicament as one of a climate emergency. Again, I think it's got something to do with the fact that when you doubt your capacity to influence the people who have political power and the people who have economic power, and perhaps you doubt the public's engagement with the question, then this is one of the few resources that you still have is this kind of logic of emergency and trying to um, force things onto consideration in that fashion. So I think these are kind of the general patterns. I think they play out in different ways in different parts of the political spectrum. So, the left has its emergencies to do with climate change, to do with economic inequality. I guess right-wing politics has its own emergencies, things that it kind of constructs as such to do with migration, racial replacement, these kind of things. Again, this is the language of emergency tends to be quite central to how the right and the far right approaches the things it considers problematic about the world around it. And of course, you might say there are sort of centrist emergencies to do with AI or global geopolitics, breakdown of the liberal international order, and so on. So, from all these different types of political orientation, each have their different motivation, each have their different content, but maybe there's a common theme of um, political actors responding to a world in flux and doubting their capacity to control it, to bring it to heal in some way, and therefore reliant on a register of urgency and of quick action and decision making to contend with that.
That's really interesting. It made me think of I can't remember who wrote it, but I think there's a book called Hyperpolitics where the
Anton
author,
Jaeger, I think.
yeah, where he talks about kind of like the exit costs being much lower to kind of like organizations, kind of like political parties and things like that, and that kind of contributing to this like speeding up of kind of like the ups and downs of particular politicians and particular like political parties. I think I'm right in saying that Five Star in Italy kind of like purposefully didn't have any like physical spaces that they kind of like organized in as a party, which kind of I do think talks to that sense of like it was easy to kind of get into the party and leave the party as well, which is so I think that seems really interesting to me that those kind of ideas of less control and kind of like ease of exit from particular kind of like institutions, or I mean maybe from also particular kind of like allegiances to ideas,
Hmm.
um kind of like go together, because I think I feel that myself personally, honestly, in terms of kind of like the issues I care about, which include climate breakdown and like the risk of AI. Um, but I guess one thing that I was also wondering was whether you think that that logic might like extend further to other aspects of kind of like trying to control your life in the medium term. The reason I ask this is that I think in the UK, young people are like buying houses much less than they were previously. I mean, obviously there's loads of reasons for that, but they're also having less children. They're also going to university less. There's also a big attendance crisis in schools. And to me, they are all kind of like medium term investments to some extent. They're just kind of like investing in those things. I think it's Peter Mandler wrote a book, was it Crisis, where he basically argued that in the 20th century there was only one decade where the university enrollment went down, which I think was the 1970s. And he kind of argued that people in that decade were kind of like losing faith in the future. So I guess I wonder whether those experiences or those data points, do you think there's any link between those trends and kind of like the idea of a future being foreclosed and like less control?
I think there is, yeah. So I think all of these things that you mention are things that kind of they're sort of long-term projects, often maybe individual personal projects or family projects, but they're kind of things that require you to have a certain confidence in the possibility of planning, of thinking ahead by a decade or two. Whether that's a house or children or university, as you say, things that may also have short-term costs. In other words, the sense that you only really engage them if you can see the light at the end of a tunnel that you have to pass through in order to reap the benefits. So I do think that when you see a world that seems to be very fast changing, that seems to make planning seem kind of impossible or somewhat naive, then that's clearly something that makes this all these activities that require a longer term perspective a little bit less appealing, and all the more so, of course, for those who are especially precarious in their economic conditions. In other words, this, of course, has clear class differentiations, and the ones that are going to be in the most precarious situations are likely to be those that are least able to count on things like even just basic job security, and that as a foundation on which to kind of construct everything else that you've mentioned. I think maybe one way of, because in some ways this is not new, I guess, but maybe one way of thinking about it as well would be to say that the role of political organizations like parties, movements, is perhaps always been somehow to kind of counterbalance that, to give people collective perspectives on the future that allow them to nonetheless have a future orientation despite these conditions of economic insecurity that they may be stuck in the short term, even if they are aligned with that party for the hope of longer term structural improvement. But if then parties themselves stop making available more collective visions of the future, then you get kind of people are left reliant only on the kind of the futures that they can muster from their own life course, and then exactly they're all the more um, challenged by exactly the kind of the loss of confidence that comes with being unable to plan your personal economic or social or marital security or whatever kind of format you see it taking. And yeah, so I think these, as you say, these all have multiple origins. There's multiple kind of circular logics here, to the extent that people struggle to buy a house or find accommodation to plan their personal lives and so on. Then if you feel yourself locked out of these pursuits, then of course then you start to lack long-term reference points. And so again, this in turn undermines the confidence in the future that you might otherwise have. There's plenty of kind of potentials for vicious circles here, I think. But the links, I think, are pronounced, and one of the stakes of the political application of the future, as you might call it, is that it just kind of accentuates these problems as they play out at the individual level.
Interesting. That's really interesting. One of the things that I found really fascinating about your book was was your kind of like exploration of fascism and I hadn't really thought about fascism in the terms that you kind of wrote about it in the book, in terms of like considering like the impulsiveness as like a tendency within fascism, and a kind of like their general kind of approach to like the future and history. Um, and I guess I was wondering, like, do you think there's a risk that fascism becomes like more appealing in this moment because of the kind of situation we're in?
I think yes. Partly, as I say, it's got everything to do with what other parties are doing. I think whenever you have to think about the appeal of a certain political orientation, it's maybe at most 50% about the intrinsic appeal of that orientation, and at least as much about the appeal of everything around it, or the lacking appeal of anything around it. So I think precisely as other parties of centre and centre left become less willing to approach kind of develop visions of the future, visions of alternatives, and so on, that kind of that does leave a kind of vacuum. But also, I think maybe it's worth highlighting that I mean, fascism is kind of undemanding in what it asks people to think about the future. This is not like socialism, for example, where maybe you have to have confidence in progress, confidence in perhaps the measurability of progress, the capacity to find evidence for it, um, and various forms of liberalism likewise. Those perhaps that are more kind of economics focused, of course, then maybe have to have the credibility that comes with accurate prediction and so on. This is not really the game that fascism is in. I mean, I think it's a kind of if we can speak of it as an ideology, it's one where perhaps a lower weight is placed on internal coherence than many other ideologies, like liberalism and socialism have tended to place. In other words, fascism, I think, going back to the 30s and even 20s, um, it's often emphasized this as a kind of a doctrine of action and not of theory. People around Mussolini and Mussolini himself saying exactly this: don't judge us by some notion of putative logic that you're going to hold us to. No, we are about action first and decision, um, and we make our truths rather than simply formulating them in advance and then somehow merely acting retrospectively in adhesion to them. So it's a kind of politics where you can make it up as you go along, where you don't have to necessarily apologize too much for incoherence, but also for uncertainty, for surprises, for not doing what you say you'll do, because this is somehow, I think, all priced in with fascism. It's a kind of a politics of unpredictability and wrong-footing opponents, and sometimes even deliberately contradicting your own line, so that it's much harder for critics to kind of hold a normative standard against you. So this, I think, in a condition of kind of crisis times where everything is changing fast anyway, where it's very hard to plausibly make predictions or develop coherent programs of action, then fascism just says, fine, we don't do that. All we do is we disrupt. We throw things in the air. We're going to have maybe a bit of fun as we go about it. There's a kind of emotional appeal to the exhilaration of disruption and chaos, but and also to the violence that comes with that, to the pain that comes with that. So it sort of embraces the chaos and unpredictability of crisis times and makes that somehow its calling card. So absolutely, I think in this respect, what I call the impulsiveness of fascism, the kind of act first and think later, if at all, aspect to it is always going to be peculiarly well suited to times in which that seems to be what is happening almost anyway, that things are just changing with a rapidity that it makes it very hard to be coherent and considered in your actions.
That's really interesting. I guess that like indeterminacy is hard to fight against as well, or it's hard to argue with because it's a kind of moving target. And it reminds me of I think on the weekend I saw Donald Trump was sort of like being really nice to Zoran Mamdani, which I think kind of like wrong-footed a lot of people. Um, and it feels like that is kind of like a characteristic of his that he is relatively like indeterminate. Um,
Exactly, exactly. I mean, it's very hard to know what you're against when you're against someone of that uh, disposition. It also, in addition to simply the kind of the wrong footing effect, I guess it can allow such an individual to present themselves as kind of free thinking, uh, charismatic, precisely because they're unpredictable. They can say, well, they're authentic. I say it how I see it. Um, I'm not kind of trying to stick to a line just because it's correct or something. This sort of impulsiveness, I think, is not just bemusing to those around it, but acts as a kind of an indicator of unfiltered self-expression, which then, for certain types of audience, can be read as a sign of authenticity, of strong will, and so on. So I do think deliberate self-contradiction, or at least a kind of indifference to norms of consistency and coherence, is part of the appeal here. And it allows a kind of opportunism. It allows you to take advantage of whatever seems like the opportunity at hand without thinking too much about how it coheres with other situations past and to come.
yeah, that's really interesting. I read an article on the weekend, which talked about the fact that lots of uh, TV shows that are popular right now are kind of like game shows in which you win lots of money, like Squid Games, for example. And I think there's a few other kind of American shows like that at the moment. The article was sort of arguing, or the journalist was arguing that kind of displays some form of idea of kind of like our society is zero sum, and the get rich quick schemes are like one of the only ways out of potentially like a difficult situation. So I felt that that kind of spoke to what we were talking about earlier in terms of like the lack of control over one's life, and like the only kind of way out is potentially kind of like a game show.
Yeah,
Um,
and the lottery, I guess, would be the obvious example as well. In other words,
yeah,
chance, chance, rolling the dice is the best hope of a different future.
yeah. Do you see any signs though of either politicians or institutions kind of like trying to regain a sense of like the medium term? Have you seen like examples of that or?
Well, in some ways, sure. At the political margins on the left, I think there's plenty of experiments going on of um, efforts to organise in a way that's not just about, or not even primarily about, winning the next election. So in this country, clearly the Greens, and that not just under Zach Belansky, but I think that's for some time has been their position that uh, obviously you're not going to win the next election, but you have to think of how to develop some kind of cause that is nonetheless consequential, regardless of whether you can understand that in terms of electoral success. Under Polanski, clearly that's taken a much more sharper and kind of influential form, insofar as this is kind of now speaking a left-wing language that seems to be pretty much absent in the rest of the parliamentary parties in Westminster. And yeah, I would say this is. I wouldn't want to say it's kind of long-termism at the expense of immediacy, of urgency. Clearly, the Greens, more than any political party, are aware of the climate science and the need in which to act quickly for contemporary questions. But I think what you see here is kind of a sense of beginning with urgency, but continuing indefinitely, thinking the longer term, not just thinking about how to win the next election, but how to influence public discourse, how to influence other political parties that maybe will win the next election, how to kind of build a cause that will outlive the particular electoral cycle that you happen to be in. I think the uh, Jeremy Corbyn and Sultana, your party, we'll see where that goes, but there's clearly some effort again, I think, to try and conceive a party that's more centred on a political vision rather than kind of electoral machine. And possibly Mamdani, as you mentioned in New York, is again something different. I think to some degree you have to kind of in order to be electorally successful, maybe you have to realize that it's not the first priority, that you have to find a way of building some kind of movement that is going to maybe be successful in a few cycles further down the track in order to have any real political profile and substance in the nearer term that maybe offers you chance of success before that. So I think these are experiments that are perhaps speaking to the kind of frustrations with the reactive logic of emergency politics, kind of trying to pursue something that's much more like a normative vision of politics rather than simply firefighting problems as they arise. And perhaps maybe what's also interesting about a number of these experiments is it's not just at the level of the rhetoric, it's about kind of the organizational structure that underpins this. So it seems to me that there's a kind of a fake response to the charge of short-termism, which you see articulated almost everywhere, including in the last Labour manifesto, which is sort of at the level of rhetoric that says, well, we know that everyone is frustrated with short-termism and crisis management, and so we're gonna think a little bit more long-term here, and we're gonna think about goals for the next 10 years and so on. We'll give you however many thousand nurses by 2030 or whatever. These very kind of specific and almost accountancy-like ways of sketching out the further future. I think that's a kind of fake response to short-termism because it doesn't really go much beyond goals set by leadership, which it itself is basically entirely in control of. It doesn't really make itself accountable to anyone that's going to hold it to those goals. I think if you really want long-termism in politics, however you define long-termism, simply something longer than the next electoral cycle, I think if you want that, then you have to create the political structures that will mean that leaders are held to those goals. You need to strengthen the position of activists in parties, for example, who are the ones that tend to join parties because they care about the longer term project, the cause. If you don't empower those people, then you're probably going to find that even the most well-intentioned leaders are going to make pretty severe compromises pretty quickly. So I think insofar as you see any interesting experiments in the present, they're interesting insofar as they're not just about talking how we need to be a bit more long-termist or a little bit more visionary, but that they are also looking at that question of how do you empower those people for whom that is kind of second nature, the people that join collectives without expecting any real immediate power, but want to sign up to something they believe in. Empower those people, and then you've got a more, I think, authentic kind of long-term politics.
Interesting. It's interesting you said that some of those projects had a kind of normative dimension to them. Because I have often wondered myself, like, how does one, I know this might be a slightly different point, but I've often wondered kind of like, is there a set of morals that really work in our contemporary society? And what I mean by that is kind of like, given, say, like the ecological crisis and like, climate breakdown, all the different competing kind of like candidates for what most important emergencies are. And I know that in your book you talk about kind of like there isn't an agreement on what the most urgent kind of like issues are. But I often wonder kind of like what would be a coherent kind of like moral framework. Because I was even reading on the weekend actually about there's a book David Runciman or reviewed, and he was talking about the fact that actually having children could be good for climate breakdown because it changes the population structure so that you potentially have more progressive politics. And that kind of stunned me, honestly, because I had assumed having children was really, was like one of the worst things you could do for the climate. Because I think that's like, there's plays about this and all kinds of things. So I don't know, that's destabilizing, like, because what is like a moral framework to kind of use? So I guess, yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, on kind of like, is one of the reasons why it's difficult to kind of like approach politics from a normative or kind of like moral point of view, I suppose, because it's like not clear what morals work in this kind of like current situation. I always think this about Keir Starmer whenever I mean, he appears to kind of like know the answer to the question. or like he portrays himself as like knowing like what the answers to all the questions are. And I think that that's a big, contrast to how Trump kind of like presents himself, because he doesn't present himself as know all the answers, because he kind of like changes the answers day to day. So I guess, yeah, do you think that is part of the problem, that we don't really have like a kind of like coherent moral framework about how...
I mean, I think it's certainly the case that any type of moral position comes under a certain strain in conditions that are plausibly seen as unprecedented. In other words, morality presupposes some type of continuity with the past. Morals are, I guess, those things that are understood to be inherited in some way, of course, refined, something that you can put under light of critical scrutiny, but not something you simply make up on the spot, because that's, I guess, not quite how we normally see morality. And yet, when you're in a situation where the major issues of the day are so often said to be unprecedented, that they are unlike anything in the past. And clearly, climate change is often presented in these terms, but then artificial intelligence, likewise. These are all things that seem to put you on the cusp of a quite different type of historical situation. And I guess it's always the sort of the susceptibility that society has to emergency claims in general is that if you can present a situation as unique, then you can say that it needs a kind of unique response that has got nothing perhaps to do with existing normative precepts, that you're in a new world. Therefore, let's not worry about the morality that we bring to it from the old world. So I think that is one of the genuinely confusing and disorienting aspects of the present. I think at some level one has to almost refuse a little bit the idea that the contemporary situation is quite so unique and unprecedented, because I think the cost of accepting that point is basically to sort of embrace this this disorientation, and then you can quickly, I think, find yourself acquiescing in the mere exercise of power and the things, and not really having any type of normative standpoint from which to take distance from realpolitik and the kind of the exercise of power by the strongest, whether it's in politics or economics. So I think that is part of our difficulty. As I say, I don't think it's I don't think it can be allowed to be insurmountable. I think we have to assert the continuities. I think the world has always been a changing environment, and morality is always somehow requiring a sort of leap of faith whereby we can say that things that ideas that developed before the present nonetheless have purchase in the present. That's a sort of a leap of faith that is hardly new to the present. And of course, the revolutionary moments that we talked about earlier in the 18th century are kind of first instances of that. Is the revolutionary moment one in which there's no normativity, no morality? Well, maybe sometimes it looks like that when you get a lot of executions in quick succession. But I think at the same time, one wants to say that even in these exceptional moments, there has to be some kind of appeal to limits on what can be done, or at least some kind of moral compass has to be applied, even if we disagree where that's exactly going to point us to. Nonetheless, I think we're going to want to say there's got to be some way of grappling in moral terms, and not just in terms of immediate inclinations with these situations of great extreme and great unfamiliarity. So I think it's part of the challenge, but I think it's a challenge that that has to be refused. I think, therefore, it's going to be about how to take existing normative frameworks, ideologies, and find ways of reconceiving them for exactly this kind of context. So ideas of, 21st century socialism, ways in which we might say there is something that is enduring in claims of equality, as something precisely what you want to see as living and dead in 19th century socialism is clearly the key issue here. But that there are certain enduring features of ideas of equality, even in ideas of progress, and of the economic conditions that one has to pursue in order to make these things more than simply formal goods. These I think are enduring questions, and the kind of things that the left is talking about today, about wealth taxes, about land taxes, about how to find forms of justice in production as well as in just in distribution. These, I think, are all questions that are just as important in a climate emergency or in an escalating kind of emergency of economic concentrations of wealth. The situations may look new, but I think there's still a kind of lodestar to be found in some of the more familiar ideological perspectives if we really think what they might mean in a new context. So I think for me that's the position. Yes, this is what's disorienting about unique circumstances or ones that seem to be such, but nonetheless um, the challenge must indeed be to find those continuities and distill from them ways of thinking normatively in the political moment.
That's a really good point. And I suppose that some of the examples you mentioned earlier, I guess, are kind of instances of that. I had one final question, which was about a kind of like long-termism movement, I think it's right to call it. So I think there are people who kind of I would say seem to be like thinking about the long term in like a lot of detail, including kind of like effective altruists, for example. And people like Toby Ord, I think I've written books about kind of like the importance of considering the long-term view. I guess in some ways, unlike the Fabians, they're probably not like gradualist, maybe. They're more kind of like accelerationist, kind of like long-term thinkers. But I mean, I suppose, yeah, do you think that, because you talk about kind of like thinking about an abundance of time, like these people seem to be thinking about an abundance of time to some degree. Um, um, would you say that's true for the like this long-termist movement?
Uh, yes, in a sense. I mean, they're clearly stepping back to take the longest timescales into perspective, the timescales of transhumanism, of interstellar travel, and so on. Something that I try to suggest in the book is that there's kind of um, twin challenges to a democratic politics that comes both on the one hand from what you might call short-termism, and that also comes from perhaps a kind of excessive long-termism. So on the one hand, maybe the first one is kind of more intuitive, that we might say, well, short-termism is a limit on the political imagination because there are long-term goals that we might want to pursue of equality, liberty, things that take time, not sort of to be equated with transformations that you can pursue within a year or two. These are projects. And so clearly a politics that is deaf to the longer timescales required for deep structural transformations of society is gonna miss something. At the same time, I think this kind of fascination with the furthest futures is something that can also be quite paralyzing, at least for democratic politics, insofar as it kind of has a sort of flattening effect on the significance of the present. And it's not just these contemporary philosophical movements that have that effect. I mean, I think there are forms of utopian thought going back a number of centuries where you see the same kind of interest in the far future, several centuries into the future, where the effect is somehow to diminish the present and to diminish the choices of the present, because ultimately, if you're thinking in terms of many centuries, does it really matter what you do in the near term? Anything, I guess, less than an existential threat to the human race in the present becomes sort of no problem at all, almost, because the kind of the meaningful timescales of change are well beyond that. And the same thing, kind of conversely, anything that is a existential threat or can be presented as such and in the present sort of trumps all competing considerations. I think the kind of long-termism that one sees in these effective altruist movements is exactly, I think it's philosophically, it's it's got some substance, but in terms of what its democratic implications may be, it's really something that I think is almost as pernicious as a severe short-termism, because it really doesn't brook democratic disagreement very easily. It has a tendency to kind of treat certain types of policy as trumps for the sake of the long-term survival of the human race, and likewise to see certain types of inequality as essentially irrelevant or perhaps even functional to longer-term gains in utility. So, so I think if you're thinking about these questions of the future from a democratic perspective, rather than a perspective in a certain kind of moral philosophy, then I think one has to. And here there's kind of no magic number, and it's somewhat arbitrary, but there is a kind of a democratic future that I would put something on the scale of kind of decades. In other words, long enough that one can meaningfully think about structural transformations of society, and yet not so long as to make the contribution of living individuals and their commitment somehow epiphenomenal to the future that plays out, that still makes agency somehow meaningful in the present. And so, to that extent, I wouldn't want to be an advocate of long-termism on the scale of millennia, because it's I think it's, while it may have some philosophical coherence, or at least that the philosophical coherence is a separate question in terms of its political implications, I think it's clearly quite either paralyzing or quite deterministic.